They are America's greatest treasures, vast cathedrals of stone and sky, sanctuaries of towering green and silent blue water. We see them as places of escape, of beauty, of a sacred return to the wild. Yellowstone, Yosemite, the Great Smoky Mountains, Sequoia, Acadia. We venture into them to find ourselves, to disconnect from the noise of our world. We hike the trails, we pitch our tents by the fire, and we sleep under a blanket of stars, believing we are safe, believing we are alone. But for some, that sanctuary becomes a tomb. The wilderness holds secrets. It watches with ancient, patient eyes. The deeper you go, the thinner the veil becomes between our world and something else. The stories you are about to hear are not fiction. They are not campfire tales crafted to make you jump. They are real accounts, chilling, true encounters reported by hikers, campers, and rangers who ventured just a little too far off the path. They went seeking beauty, but they found something else, something that was waiting. Tonight, we explore 5 true, terrifying stories from the deep woods of America's national forests. What is really lurking in the woods? Join us as we uncover the terrifying reality that hides behind the beauty. Story 1, The Man in the Trees, Yellowstone National Park. Our first story comes from Yellowstone. It's a place of geothermal wonders and abundant wildlife. But its sheer size, over 2.2 million acres, means vast swaths of it are rarely, if ever, touched by human feet. This is where Mark and Sarah, experienced hikers in their late 20s, decided to spend a 3-day backpacking trip. They had chosen a less traveled trail, one that promised solitude and pristine views of the backcountry. The first day was idyllic. The air was crisp, the sky was a piercing blue, and the only sounds were their boots on the trail and the distant bugle of an elk. They felt, as many do, like they had the entire park to themselves. The feeling began to change on the afternoon of the second day. They were navigating a dense section of lodgepole pines. The forest floor was a soft carpet of needles, which made their progress eerily quiet. Sarah stopped first. "Mark," she whispered, not turning around, "do you hear that?" Mark paused, straining his ears. "Hear what? I don't hear anything." "Exactly," she said, her voice tight. "No birds, no squirrels, nothing. It's just dead quiet." He listened again. She was right. The constant, ambient chatter of the forest had vanished. All he could hear was the faint rush of wind in the canopy far above them. An oppressive silence had settled over the woods. It felt unnatural. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. "It's probably just the time of day, Sarah. Let's keep moving," Mark said, trying to sound confident. But a prickle of unease had already started on his own neck. They walked for another 10 minutes, the silence pressing in on them. And then they heard it. They both froze. It came from their left, deep in the trees, maybe 50 yards out. It wasn't the sound of a deer, which is light and cautious. It wasn't the heavy rolling gait of a bear. It sounded bipedal. It sounded like one single, deliberate step. Mark scanned the dense woods. "Hello?" he called out. His voice sounded thin. "Anyone there?" Only the silence answered. "It's probably just a buck," he muttered, grabbing Sarah's hand. "Come on." They started walking again, faster this time, and as soon as they did, they heard it again. One step, then 2. It was moving with them, not at them, but with them. It was keeping pace, perfectly parallel to the trail. "Mark, it's following us," she whispered, her eyes wide with panic. "Don't run," Mark ordered, his voice low and firm. "Whatever it is, don't run. We act normal. We just keep walking." But how do you act normal when you can hear something large stalking you from just beyond the line of sight? They could hear its weight shifting, the snap of twigs under its feet. It was big, and it was making no effort to hide its presence. It wanted them to know it was there. They walked like that for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 minutes. Every time they sped up, it sped up. Every time they slowed, it slowed. "I'm going to look," Mark finally said, stopping abruptly. "No, don't," Sarah pleaded. But he ignored her. He turned and stared directly into the woods from where the sounds were coming. He squinted, trying to pierce the gloom between the tightly packed pines. At first he saw nothing, just a maze of trunks and shadows. "See? Nothing," he said, turning back. And that's when Sarah screamed. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking past him, back up the trail they had just walked. What? He yelled, spinning around. It was standing on the trail, 20 yards behind them. It had circled back. It had let them pass it, and now it was blocking their way out. Mark's blood ran cold. It was wrong. That was the only word his brain could supply. It was shaped like a man, but it was far too tall, at least 7, maybe 8 feet. And it was impossibly thin, its limbs elongated like stretched taffy. It was covered in what looked like matted dark fur or ragged clothing. It was hard to tell in the shadows. But the worst part, the part that made Mark's stomach clench in primal fear, was its head. It didn't seem to have a human face. It was just a pale, smooth oval, like a mask or a skull. And it was tilted to one side, as if studying them with an intelligence that was utterly alien. It just stood there, perfectly still. Mark, Sarah was crying, pulling on his arm. Mark, what is it? Mark couldn't speak. He was paralyzed. The creature hadn't moved. It just watched them. He fumbled for his bear spray, his fingers feeling thick and useless. The creature slowly raised one of its long, thin arms. It pointed, not at them, but at the woods, deeper into the woods, off the trail, as if it were giving them a direction, an invitation. That single, simple gesture broke Mark's paralysis. It wasn't an animal. This was a trap. Run, he screamed. He didn't care about the don't run rule. He grabbed Sarah and they plunged off the trail, away from the creature, crashing through the underbrush in a blind panic. They didn't run towards where it had pointed. They ran in the opposite direction, scrambling over fallen logs, branches whipping their faces. They could hear it behind them. It wasn't running. It was just walking. A calm, steady, unhurried pace. It didn't need to run. It was gaining on them. They burst out of the trees and nearly fell into a deep, fast-moving creek. Across! Now! Mark yelled. They plunged into the icy water, the shock stealing their breath. They scrambled, slipped on the mossy rocks, and clawed their way up the other bank. When they looked back, the creature was standing on the bank they had just left. It stopped at the water's edge. It tilted its head again, that same horrifying, inquisitive gesture. It watched them, wet and shivering. Then, slowly, it turned around and walked back into the dense pine forest, disappearing as silently as it had arrived. Mark and Sarah didn't stop running. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out. They got hopelessly lost. It took them 6 hours, well after dark, to finally stumble back onto a main park road where a terrified tourist found them, borderline hypothermic and incoherent. They told the rangers what they saw. The rangers listened politely, then wrote it up as a grizzly bear encounter. But Mark and Sarah knew what they saw. A bear doesn't stand on 2 legs for that long. A bear doesn't have a pale, smooth face. A bear doesn't stalk you, circle you, and then point you deeper into the woods to your doom. They never went backpacking again. They said the silence of the woods was no longer peaceful. It was expectant. When the entire forest goes silent, it's said that a predator is near. But what kind of predator stands 8 feet tall, blocks your path, and invites you into the shadows? What would you have done? Story 2. The Voice That Calls Your Name. Great Smoky Mountains. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park is the most visited national park in the United States. It's known for its ancient mist-covered peaks and its deep, lush forests. It's also the epicenter of some of the most baffling disappearance cases in the missing 411 phenomenon, a term coined by researcher David Paulides for clusters of unexplained disappearances in wild areas. Our second story follows a group of 3 college friends, Tom, Ben, and Chloe. They were on their fall break, looking for a classic off-the-grid camping experience. They hiked 6 miles into the backcountry, far from any designated campground, and set up their 2 small tents in a clearing near a stream. The first night was perfect. They cooked hot dogs, told stories, and watched the embers of their fire die down under a clear, starry sky. They zipped up their tents, Tom and Ben in one, Chloe in her own, and fell asleep to the sound of the babbling water. The terror began at 3:14 a.m. Tom was woken up by a voice. It was faint, coming from the edge of the woods. Tom? He sat up in his sleeping bag, his heart immediately pounding. Ben was snoring lightly beside him. Tom fumbled for his headlamp and clicked it on. "Chloe?" he whispered, thinking it was her. "Tom." The voice came again, louder this time. And it wasn't Chloe. He knew that voice. He'd known it his whole life. "Mom?" he whispered to himself, his skin crawling. It was impossible. His mother was in Ohio, hundreds of miles away. He must be dreaming. He lay back down, pulling his sleeping bag tighter, shutting his eyes. "Tom! Help me! I'm over here!" He shot up, wide awake. That was not a dream. It was his mother's voice, and she was in pain. He unzipped the tent fly, adrenaline surging through him. Ben stirred next to him. What's going on, man?" "Shh, listen," Tom hissed. They both sat in the dark, listening. The forest was pitch black outside the small dome of their tent. "Tom, please, I'm hurt. I'm by the trees. Help me." Ben's eyes went wide. "Dude, what the hell? That sounds exactly like your mom." "It is my mom," Tom said, his voice frantic. He was already pulling on his boots. "She must have driven down to surprise us. Maybe her car broke down. She's hurt." "Tom, wait," Ben said, grabbing his arm. "That makes no sense. How would she even find us? We're 6 miles from any road. There's no signal. It's 3 a.m. "I don't care," Tom yelled, tearing his arm away. "That's my mother." He burst out of the tent and shined his headlamp toward the tree line. "Mom, I'm coming. Where are you?" "Over here. Hurry. I fell." The voice was coming from a dense thicket of rhododendrons about 100 yards from their camp. "Stay here, man," Tom shouted at Ben, and he started to run. "Tom, no, wait!" Ben yelled, scrambling for his own light. At that moment, the fly on the other tent unzipped. Chloe poked her head out, her face pale with confusion. What's all the yelling? Who is Tom talking to? Ben looked at her, his face a mask of terror. He thinks he hears his mom. "What? But I heard my dad. He was calling my name, saying he was lost." Ben's blood froze. He looked at Chloe, then at the darkness where Tom had disappeared. "Tom, come back!" Ben screamed. "It's a trap! It's not your mom!" They heard Tom stop crashing through the brush. There was a long, terrible silence. The only sound was the stream. "Tom?" called Ben, his voice shaking. More silence. And then they heard a new sound. It wasn't a voice. It was a scream. A high-pitched, agonizing scream that was unmistakably Tom's. It was cut off, instantly, as if a hand had been clamped over his mouth. Ben and Chloe stood frozen by the dead fire pit, their small headlamps cutting useless cones of light into the all-consuming darkness. What do we do?" Chloe was sobbing. We stay in the light," Ben said, his mind racing. "We relight the fire. We do not go into those woods. We yell for Tom from here." They spent the next 4 hours screaming Tom's name, their voices growing hoarse. They built the fire up into a roaring blaze. They banged their metal pots together. There was no response, no voice, no Tom. As the first sickly gray light of dawn began to break, Ben and Chloe, trembling with fear and exhaustion, made a decision. They left everything, the tents, the food, their packs. They grabbed a single water bottle and they ran. They ran the 6 miles back to their car without stopping, without looking back. They reported Tom missing to the park rangers. The search and rescue operation was one of the largest in the park's history. They used dogs, helicopters, and dozens of volunteers. They scoured the area for weeks. They found the campsite, just as Ben and Chloe had left it. They found Tom's headlamp on the ground, 10 feet from where he had entered the thicket of rhododendrons. It was switched off. The dogs, trackers, they found nothing. The dogs would follow the scent to the headlamp, then stop, whining and confused, as if Tom had simply vanished into thin air. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, no animal tracks. Tom was never found. Ben and Chloe were questioned for months. Their stories never wavered. Ben was haunted by the voice. He knew it was Tom's mother. Chloe was just as certain she had heard her father. Whatever was in the woods that night, it knew them. It knew who they loved, and it used that love as a lure. The Great Smoky Mountains are full of such stories, voices in the night luring people away. What would you have done? Would you have run after the voice of a loved one in distress? Or would you have listened to your friend who heard something entirely different? Do you still think they were alone? Story 3, The Silent Camp, Sequoia National Forest. Park rangers are a special breed. They are pragmatic, trained observers, deeply familiar with the land they protect. They've seen it all: foolish tourists, dangerous animals, and the worst of nature's weather. It takes a lot to truly unsettle them. Our third story comes from a retired park ranger named Al, who worked in the Sequoia National Forest for over 30 years. He still won't tell this story after dark. It happened in the late 1990s during a routine patrol of a remote backcountry zone. This area was popular with thru hikers, people hiking the Pacific Crest Trail. It was a warm, clear evening in August. Al was on horseback, finishing his loop, when he smelled smoke. It wasn't the smell of a wildfire, it was the pleasant, contained smell of a campfire. He nudged his horse, Trigger, towards the scent. It was his job to check on campers, ensure they were following fire safety protocols, and check their permits. He crested a small ridge and looked down into a clearing. There it was, a single large 4-person tent. A small, well-maintained campfire was crackling away. A metal pot of water was set on a grate over the fire, just beginning to steam. 4 large backpacks were lined up neatly against a log. Everything looked perfect, except for one thing. It was silent. Utterly silent. "Hello, the camp," Al called out, his standard greeting. No answer. "Park ranger," he called, louder this time. "Just here to check your permit." Nothing. Just the crackle of the fire and the gentle stamping of his horse. Trigger tossed his head, his ears flicking nervously. The horse didn't like this. Al didn't either. He dismounted, tying Trigger's reins to a low-hanging branch. "Sir? Ma'am? Anyone home?" He walked slowly into the camp. The feeling of wrongness grew with every step. The pot on the fire, it was full of water with noodles and dried vegetables floating in it. Dinner. It was halfway through being cooked. A small bag of trail mix was open on the log next to the backpacks. A map was laid out, weighed down by a rock. It looked like the occupants had just walked away, mid-activity. "Hello?" Al called again, standing a few feet from the tent. The zipper was closed. He felt a cold dread he hadn't felt in his entire career. This wasn't right. This was deeply wrong. People don't just walk away from a hot meal in the middle of the wilderness. He reached out and, against his better judgment, pulled the tent zipper. A slow, metallic zip. The tent was empty. 4 sleeping bags were unrolled inside. 4 small pillows. A paperback book lay open on one of the unrolled bags, face down, as if the reader had just set it down to stir the noodles. But that wasn't the detail that made Al's heart stop. It was the shoes. Lined up neatly just outside the tent's entrance were 4 pairs of hiking boots, heavy-duty, expensive boots, caked in trail dust, and next to them 2 pairs of sandals. All the footwear was there. Al backed away from the tent. He looked around the clearing, his eyes scanning the tree line. The ground was dry, hard-packed dirt and pine needles. He wasn't a tracker, but he could see no obvious signs of a struggle. No drag marks, no blood, no ripped clothing, and more importantly, no animal tracks. No bear, no mountain lion. The food was untouched. The pot was steaming. A bear would have gone for the food. A mountain lion, a struggle would have been obvious. He backed up until his shoulders hit his horse. Trigger was practically trembling. His eyes rolled back, staring at the woods. "Easy, boy," Al whispered, but his voice was shaking. He stood there for 10 minutes, watching the pot on the fire. The water began to boil. The noodles began to soften. The sun began to dip below the ridge, casting long, sinister shadows into the silent camp. Al did the only thing he could. He rode back. He rode hard and fast, not stopping until he was at his ranger station. He called it in. The search began the next morning. They found the camp exactly as Al had left it. The fire had burned out. The pot of noodles was now a cold, congealed stew. The 4 pairs of boots were still lined up. The hikers were a family, a mother, a father, and their 2 teenage children. Their permits were in one of the backpacks. Their wallets, keys, and IDs were all there. The search teams scoured hundreds of square miles. They found nothing. Not a single trace. It was as if the family of 4 had been abducted by the sky. But the detail that haunted Al, the detail that he still can't explain, was the shoes. Why would 4 experienced hikers in the middle of the rugged Sequoia wilderness leave their camp, their hot food, their very identities, and walk off into the forest, barefoot? They were never heard from again. The case went cold. Just another file of unexplained disappearances. But Al knew, you don't just walk away. Something or someone came into that camp. Something that didn't leave a single track. Something that could make 4 people leave their shoes, their fire, and their lives behind. What could possibly make an entire family abandon a hot meal and walk barefoot into the unforgiving wilderness? They left their boots, their protection, their supplies. It's as if they left in a hurry, or perhaps as if they were convinced they wouldn't need shoes where they were going. Story 4, The Visitor at the Window, Acadia National Park. When we think of horror, we often think of isolation, and there are few places on the East Coast as beautifully, ruggedly isolating as Maine's Acadia National Park in the off-season. Our 4th story comes from a woman named Jenna, a medical student who decided to de-stress from her exams with a solo camping trip in late October. The main park campgrounds were closed, so she rented a small, primitive lean-to cabin on the park's quiet western side. The cabin was just 1 room, 3 wooden walls, and an open front facing the woods, with a fire pit about 20 feet away. It was simple, rustic, and exactly what she needed. The first day was beautiful. She hiked, read by the fire, and as night fell, she settled into her sleeping bag. The air was cold and sharp. The woods were filled with the sound of wind and the distant crash of the ocean. She felt completely, blissfully alone. She was wrong. She woke up around 2 a.m. The fire had burned down to glowing red embers. The wind had died, and the silence, it was heavy, like the silence in Yellowstone, a waiting silence. She lay still, listening, and then she heard it. It was coming from the outside of the cabin, from the back wall, right behind her head. Her heart hammered in her chest. It was a rhythmic, deliberate sound. Scratch, pause, scratch, pause, like a single large claw being dragged down the wooden planks. A raccoon, she told herself, or a porcupine. It's just an animal. She banged her fist on the wall. Get out of here, she yelled. The scratching stopped. Jenna let out a shaky breath. See? It's just an animal. She closed her eyes, trying to force her heart rate to slow down. She yelped. It was on the roof. It was heavy. She could hear it walking, not scurrying like a raccoon. It was a slow, heavy thump, 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 right over her head. It walked the length of the small roof, from the back wall to the open front. She was paralyzed with fear. She was staring at the open front of the lean-to, at the dying embers of her fire. She watched as a shadow fell across the firelight. Something was standing at the edge of the roof, looking down at her. She couldn't see it. She could only see its silhouette against the night sky. It was large, and it wasn't shaped like any animal she had ever seen. She held her breath. She didn't move a muscle for what felt like an hour. The shadow didn't move either. It just stood there, watching. After an eternity, the heavy thump, thump, thump started again, moving back towards the rear of the cabin. She heard a heavy thud as it landed on the soft ground behind the cabin. Silence.
Jenna lay there until dawn, her eyes wide open, flinching at every snap of a twig. She told herself it was a bear. It had to be a bear. The next morning, exhausted, she packed up her things. She was leaving. As she rolled up her sleeping bag, she tried to rationalize it. A bear, a big, curious bear. She walked out of the lean-to, and just to prove her own theory, she walked around to the back of the cabin to look for bear tracks or claw marks. There were claw marks, 3 long, deep gashes running vertically down the wood, ending about 5 feet from the ground. But that wasn't what made her sick. Below the claw marks, in the soft mud near the cabin's foundation, was a handprint. It was not a paw print. It was a handprint, but it was grotesque. It was the size of a dinner plate, with 5 long, thin fingers that must have ended in the claws that marked the wall. She stared at it, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. It was right here, she whispered. And then she saw the other marks. The cabin had one small glass window on its side wall. It was high up for ventilation. From the inside, she wouldn't have been able to see out of it. But now, from the outside, she could see the outside of the glass, and it was covered in fog. A large, greasy smear of condensation, as if something had been pressing its face against it. In the middle of the smear was a perfect, clear circle, a small part of the glass that had been licked clean. Jenna didn't scream. She didn't make a sound. She walked very slowly to her car. She got in, locked the doors, and drove. She didn't look back. She knew, with chilling certainty, what had happened. The thing had been on the roof. It had dropped to the ground. It had left the handprint. And then it had walked to the small window. It had pressed its face to the glass, and it had watched her lie there, paralyzed in fear, for hours. It had been just feet away.
What watches us from the dark? What kind of animal leaves a handprint the size of a plate and fogs a window with its breath as it observes its prey? What if Jenna had looked out that window and seen a face looking back?
Story 5, The Thing on the Ridge, Olympic National Forest. Our final story takes place in the Olympic National Forest in Washington. It's a land of incredible diversity, from temperate rainforests to alpine peaks. It's also a place of deep, profound quiet. And it's in that quiet that things can hide. This account comes from a wildlife photographer named Ben. Ben's passion was capturing images of the elusive mountain goats that live on the high ridges. This required patience, and it required him to be in very remote, very high altitude locations, alone. He had been hiking for 2 days to reach a specific ridge that gave him a perfect view of an opposing mountainside, a known habitat for the goats. He set up his camp just below the summit, a tiny single-man tent. It was late afternoon. The golden hour was approaching. Ben set up his heavy camera on its tripod, a massive telephoto lens attached. He was scanning the far ridge, miles across a vast glacial valley. He was looking for a speck of white, a goat. He found something, but it wasn't white, and it wasn't a goat. He'd first seen it with his naked eye, a dark speck on the snow line of the opposite peak. It was moving. He assumed it was a bear or maybe another hiker. He lifted his binoculars. It was standing up on 2 legs. Another hiker, he breathed, annoyed. It would ruin his shot. He swung his camera, with its powerful lens, towards the figure. He focused. What he saw through the lens made him drop his eye from the viewfinder. His heart was a drum. No, that's not possible. He looked again, forcing himself to be objective. The figure was miles away, but the lens brought it into terrifying clarity. It was not a hiker. It was standing on a sheer, rocky precipice that no human could have scaled without extensive gear. And this thing had no gear. It was tall, unbelievably tall, and skeletal. Its limbs were horribly long and thin. It was a dark, grayish color, and it seemed to be hairless. It was standing perfectly still, its back to a sheer drop of thousands of feet. and it was staring right at him